Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Julia Stevens, an assistant professor of history at Yale University. She is an historian of modern South Asia, and her research focuses on how law has shaped religion, family, and economy in colonial and post-colonial South Asia and in the wider Indian diaspora. She teaches courses on modern South Asia, Islam, gender, and colonialism. Today we talk with Professor Stevens about the book manuscript she's currently working on, tentatively entitled Governing Islam, Law, Empire, and Secularism in South Asia. Welcome, Professor Stevens.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. So let's begin with a little overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Great. So Marilyn, my book is looking at the encounter between colonial law and Islam in South Asia, what we today think of as Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. What I'm trying to do in the book is to both tell a story about how the official system of colonial law approaches this body of religious law centered on Islam. But then the other thing I'm trying to do in the book is to think about law more broadly and to think about how law is being debated and practiced not just in the official court system, but also outside the courts. In newspaper columns, a lot of newspapers in colonial India had a special column devoted to the court system. Sure. When trials were being held, crowds would gather outside the courts waiting to hear the decision. So there's this enormous public interest in the law that I'm trying to bring in to the field of legal history. But then also, especially with Islamic law, there continues to be this really rich world of what I call vernacular legal culture, in which in madrasas, scholars are debating topics related to Islamic law, issuing fatwas, pamphlets, legal tracts. So it's sort of, the book is tracing these parallel worlds of law. And kind of out of that kind of broader notion of the law, I'm telling two entangled stories. And so the first is about what kind of happens at the official level of the overarching structures of the colonial legal system. And I argue in the book that colonial law really frames religion in a new way, religion in general and Islam in particular. And the colonial legal system has certain structures in place that kind of do this work. And one of the most important of these is something called religious personal law, which basically is how the legal system incorporates religious law. So religious law is administered through the colonial courts, but only in a really specific delineated set of cases. And this kind of box that's put around religion by the law really links it exclusively with cases involving the family and cases involving ritual practice. And what I argue in the book is that this kind of legal framing basically strongly associates religion with the family, and particularly with a family that's envisioned as traditional, patriarchal, and also associates religion with irrational beliefs and rituals that are considered to be kind of impenetrable to kind of rational thought. And so that these particular legal structures, I argue, are creating a version of secularism that has a kind of particular colonial genealogy. So my book is telling a story that is in some ways a global story across the world in the 19th and 20th century. Religion is emerging as this kind of distinct social category that is separate from secular spheres like politics and economy. But what I'm showing on top of that in the book is that there's a kind of different genealogy of that process that unfolds in a colonial context. So in metropolitan Britain, the religious and secular are also coming untangled, but in the 19th century they continue to be largely seen as compatible. And that's not true, at least at the level of official discourse in colonial India. So that's the kind of overarching story.
So you've told us about the more official law that was going on. Can you tell us a little bit about the vernacular, the more commonplace things that were happening?
Yeah, great, because I think this is really a kind of important part of the story, because in a sense, I think law always has kind of multiple sides of the story. I mean, if you think about what happens in courts, different arguments vie against each other. And so kind of by broadening the range of law that I'm looking at, what I show is that when we turn to kind of the everyday practice of law, both inside and outside the courts, that this kind of official narrative of binary division between the religious and the secular really breaks down and is disrupted in everyday practice. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is tell those two stories of how you have this overarching structure of binaries, but then when you turn to the kind of the lived life of legal practice, you have this richer story that adds a lot of complexity.
Okay. So can you give us a specific example that showcases that?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of cases involving marriages, and officially marriage is part of this domain of religious personal law. But when you have a feuding couple come into court, what you often find is they're arguing about their domestic arrangements. The wife has moved out, the husband wants her to move back in, but they're also arguing about their economic relationships, about whose monies is whose property came from which side of the family. And so it's really both a familial and an economic dispute. And when the courts actually have to deal with this particular couple, they find it much more difficult to actually totally untangle religious laws from secular laws governing things like debts and contracts.
Okay, so in a particular case, what would actually happen? I mean, what would be the outcome?
So the courts officially, create a decision where they try to still kind of parse, okay, this is the religious aspects of the case, this is the economic aspects of the case. I have literally cases that get kind of divided in half, even though they involve a single couple. But then, often what actually happens to the couple is more complex, and that maybe they actually end up resolving their dispute outside the courts by bringing family members in, and that's where the kind of story and the divide often gets complicated.
Right. Okay, so what led you to write the book?
So I think for a long time I've been struck and troubled by the way in which Islam in kind of popular perceptions, both in South Asia and in the US, tends to be portrayed with a kind of repetitive set of tropes. So we're constantly bombarded with images of Islam oppressing women. We encounter the words fanaticism and Islam almost used as synonyms. And what I really wanted to do with this book is to kind of think about those tropes more historically, because I think kind of seeing how they've evolved through the process of history actually allows us to kind of complicate and question the tropes that we kind of encounter in our daily lives.
Okay, and how did you do the research for the book?
So this was a multi-sided research project. I did a lot of work in archives in South Asia and in the UK, but I think the kind of most fun and interesting part of my research really was trying to find sources that would speak to this vernacular legal culture. And to do that, I ended up traveling to a lot of smaller libraries in South Asia that had specialized collections on Islam and Urdu language materials. And often this is a small library, but they're holding the only copy of a book or a newspaper. And so it was really a great privilege to be able to work with these materials, which are also often in very delicate condition. But I think also interestingly, I also found a decent amount of material online, because madrasas and Islamic organizations, some of the texts I study still have a real kind of life today in kind of ongoing debates about Islamic law. So
what was one of the more interesting or surprising cases that you came across?
So I think probably one of the most fun set of cases that I worked with was a series of cases involving inheritance disputes within households of prostitutes. And you know, prostitutes don't actually often come up in the kind of official record. Sometimes they hide, but they in colonial India, actually, some of these women really have a very significant amount of property, and so in the end, to deal with that property, they do come into the legal records. And so, you know, in addition to having, you know, raising really interesting questions about the law, you get this kind of window into these alternative households of women who are kind of set up their family firm as a group of women working in the sexual labor.
Do you find that the law is equitable toward women, or is it more biased towards males?
So, I mean, this is a really common perception about Islamic law, that it is patriarchal. But I think if you think about the 19th century, in fact, Islamic law provides far more protection. A married woman can actually own her own property under Islamic law, and that doesn't happen until later in the 19th century in the case of British women. So in fact, you have Muslims who are saying, look, you know, our laws are actually more progressive when you think about gender equality, and certainly in terms of property, that's, I think, a very strong argument.
And your book is very innovative in a certain way. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to innovate at two levels. One about methodology and the other about kind of an argument. And in terms of methodology, you know, and I talked about this a little bit before, it's really trying to bring together two stories that have been told by other scholars as really separate ones. So on the one hand, it's telling a story about colonial law and colonial governance, but on the other hand, it's looking at kind of the intellectual and cultural life of Muslims in South Asia. And I think when you bring those two stories together and look at how they're interacting, really interesting things happen. But in terms of the argument, you know, there's a whole kind of world of scholarship about secularism out there. But both in most of the scholarship as well as in kind of popular understandings of secularism, we really think about it as something that first evolved in Europe and then only later kind of got exported to Asia, the Middle East. But what I'm trying to show in the book is that actually particular variants of secularism emerged first and in their most exaggerated form, in fact, in this colonial context.
Oh, very interesting. And then ultimately, what do you conclude in your book?
Yeah, so I think, you know, by basically looking at how these binaries are historically constructed, I'm making a whole range of arguments intervening with the scholarship on South Asia and on Islamic law about issues of chronology, about how we understand certain Islamic legal concepts. But I think today, actually, what might be more helpful to talk about is kind of what I think my book is saying to a more general public. And I think what I'm showing is that a lot of the ways that we think about Islam actually emerge through a specific history of colonialism, and that if we understand that history, we can actually start to think outside of the ways in which Islam and secularism are often positioned in a binary relationship of opposition. And interestingly, you know, in an hour or so, I'm actually going into the classroom to teach my last class in a course on political Islam, and you know, I think really this comes out in my teaching as well, that you know, I'm trying to get students to see the ways in which you know, they have been grown up in an environment in which Islam and the West are often you know, spoken about as these two separate and opposing entities.
Right.
But as a historian, what I try to show them is that Islam is hugely internally diverse and the West is hugely internally diverse. French people and Americans understand secularism in really profoundly different ways. And then when we appreciate that internal diversity, we start to see Islam and the West not as locked in a kind of timeless relationship of opposition, but having had this very complex and varied set of mutual entanglements.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Great. Thank you, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Stevens and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.